Hi, thank you so much for joining me today. My name is Tamar Janiski. I'm an ELE educator for the Shrewsbury Public Schools, and I've been teaching English language learners for the last 20 years at both the middle and the high school levels. I'm an English learner myself and came here to the United States when I was in the third grade. At this time, there was no such thing as an ELE program, and so we have really come a long way since then. The title of the presentation is Encyclopedia Britannica, a valuable resource for building background information, developing writing skills, and synthesizing content knowledge. The image that you see here came from an Encyclopedia Britannica article about the American frontier, and this will make more sense to you a little bit later in the presentation. The lessons in this presentation are geared towards middle school students at proficiency levels 2, 3, and 4. And a couple of the language uses that you will see are inform and narrate, more specifically using the language of description. In this table, you will see some content and language objectives. I'll just choose a couple to read to you from each column. And I wanted to mention that in terms of language objectives, I've gotten in the habit of having students read the language objectives every day. And I either will post them on a whiteboard or I'll have them on my computer and project them up on a screen so that students are able to take turns and read and know what they're doing in class that day. So some of the content objectives for the lessons are students will be able to define the word frontier, students will be able to summarize important information about the American frontier, and then in terms of language objectives, students will orally select text features with a partner and make a prediction about a text they will soon read. Students will read a description, will write a description of the text features and the prediction. Students will write the definition for the word frontier, and then students will write an original sentence using the word frontier. How do the activities connect to the larger unit, designing lessons? I wanted to explain how these lessons came about and what my thought process was. The larger unit that we had been studying was focused on the theme of maps. Over here, the number 1 refers to a text that the students had already read that taught them how maps were created. We were now getting ready to read a second text called The Hardest Maps to Make, and there's a picture of it here. And as I was looking at the text itself, I came up with an idea of including activities about text features in a handout so that students can gain some background knowledge themselves and just looking at the text features and trying to make predictions what the text will be about. I also noticed that the text had the section heading called Mapping Earth's Last Frontier, and I knew my students would not be familiar with the word frontier, so I wanted them to do some work with that. And that also led me to make the connection with American frontier. And so I looked up information about American frontier and found this Encyclopedia Britannica article that you see featured here. And this is the painting that was on the first slide. The worksheet that you see here, this is the first page of the worksheet and it has 2 pages. Over here on the left-hand side, I've listed the activities on the worksheet. So the activities include modeling, using text features to make predictions, sentence frames to make a larger prediction, building vocabulary for the word frontier, and then finally looking at a painting. In terms of modeling the work for students, that's the beginning part here of the worksheet. I wanted to make sure that students knew what I was asking of them. So I used a text students had already read called Batty About Bats. And I selected the text feature of images. And the A and the B that you see here, this is the work that I wanted students to do down here on their own. So in terms of A, I wanted them to describe the text features. So here I wrote bat flying after a butterfly, which you can see in the image here. The bat is here and the butterfly is underneath it. I then wanted the students to create a complete sentence describing what they think the text or portions of the text will be about. So the example I used was the image of the bat flying after a butterfly suggests that the text will describe what bats eat. Students were then expected to work in pairs and select two main text features themselves, write about them, and then share them with the class. So students worked in pairs. They also worked as a whole group when they presented, and the 4 domains were used in this activity. The next activity was using text features in order to write a sentence frame. Students worked with their partners to fill in this sentence frame, which said, we think the text, the hardest maps to make, will be about blank because of blank. So they were using the previous work that they had done, which you can see the space for that here, about text features, and then writing a larger prediction. Students then build some background knowledge through vocabulary work, and I wanted them to determine the meaning of the word frontier. My students don't often use a dictionary, so this provided me with the opportunity to have them look up some definitions for the word frontier. And as you know, when you look up a word in English, you're often faced with a few definitions to choose from. So I wanted my students to determine which meaning of the word frontier best fit the subheading for the section, mapping Earth's last frontier. The next activity asked them to apply the word frontier in an original sentence. At this point, before I had students begin this writing activity, which you can see at the bottom of the page. So let me tell you a little bit about the writing activity. It asks students to connect the image that they see here, which I had found in the Encyclopedia Britannica article, to the word frontier. And I realized that before students would be able to do that, they would need to do some additional work. So this led me to design a number of other activities where students would examine a larger painting, and I'll show you that in the next slide, and would build their content vocabulary so they would be able to describe this painting. And then I would want them to talk about the painting and write 1 or 2 sentences about it. The final activity that you will see at the end of the slideshow asks students to build their content knowledge by reading the article about the American frontier. Because the picture that was featured on the Encyclopedia Britannica article was quite small, I found a larger picture. It was the same picture that was found in the Encyclopedia Britannica article, and here you can see a little piece of that. This is actually an image of my board, and so I zoomed in on this part of the image, and the students and I talked about what they saw here, and they didn't have the vocabulary for some of the words here, so we talked about the word barrel, and the barrel is right behind the woman here. We talked about the word child and oxen and wagon, and then the word migrating, because you can see a whole number of wagons that are migrating in the image before. We talked about the word holding because the mother is holding her baby. And then we talked about the preposition next to because this child is next to her mother. I then asked students to use their whiteboards to write a sentence describing the image. So this gave them both writing and oral practice. And here I have featured a couple of the students' responses just to give you an idea of the range of proficiency level. So one of my students wrote, the mom hold the baby and have her girl next to she, mom, and had an oxen of pulling the wagon with people and barrel, maybe other things. So here you can see that the student is really trying to include as many of the vocabulary words that we had talked about. For example, the oxen, the wagon, and the barrel also. This student wrote, "We can know that they are migrating by a wagon is carrying a big barrel and a woman that holding a baby and a boy next to a woman." This is another example for you. The mother is migrating with her two child. She is also carrying a barrel and she's also holding a baby and her child's next to her. They are migrating with the help of the wagon. So this activity allowed students to practice their writing and also to practice their oral speech because they read their sentences aloud to the class. And usually beginner students feel more comfortable sharing information that they've written down rather than having to say a sentence from memory. The final activity that I wanted to share with you focuses on using the Encyclopedia Britannica article for quite a number of things. So I was able to use the article to build students' background knowledge, to develop their vocabulary, to teach them grammar, and also to practice some note-taking skills. And here I've listed those with some more specific information. So we also talked about the purpose of using an encyclopedia. Students learned content information about the American frontier. They were able to read this challenging text and build their academic vocabulary. The grammar that we focused on included pronouns and antecedents, prepositions, prepositional phrases, objects of the prepositions, and note-taking skills. This is a picture of my board when I was doing this activity. And I just want to describe what you see here. On the right-hand side, I took the information from the article and just rearranged it in order so it would make more sense to the students. So this went along with their note-taking skills. Here I drew an arrow from a pronoun to an antecedent. I circled a word that I knew they wouldn't be familiar with here, the word characterized. And then in the article, it talks about century, and I just listed the years. So that is what you see in this image. I wanted to go ahead and read the article to you. American frontier in United States history, the advancing border that marked those lands that had been settled by Europeans. It is characterized by the westward movement of European settlers from their original settlements on the Atlantic coast, 17th century, to the west in the 19th century. So we talked about how the definition for American frontier is included here, which is the advancing border, and we talked about what advancing border means. We also discussed words like characterized, settlers, and settled. We focused on prepositions. Students took notes. This related to early American history. And then, as I said, we reorganized the notes and then my students copied those in their own notebooks. Thank you so much for joining me today. I appreciate you taking the time to listen and watch the lessons. I hope that you'll be able to use some of these lessons in your own classroom. My last slide lists some sources for you that were used in the lessons. The first one is the Encyclopedia Britannica article, followed by a text called Language, which is where the hardest maps to make came from. I then listed a couple of resources that might be helpful to you in terms of building students' background knowledge or writing content and language objectives. I also listed a link for the larger image that students use to describe immigrants crossing the plains. And then the final resource is a text that's connected to the entire subject of frontier, which my students really enjoyed. And the text is called Westward Expansion, the Louisiana Purchase found in New Zealand. Thank you again.